All right, I'm going to move along in our series called Beautiful Strength. That's a series dedicated to honoring special women and the unique type of faith, this feminine faith that is a real strength and a gift to the world that women give. And so we've been telling stories of great women in Scripture, and we're holding them up, and we're saying, let's listen to them, let's learn from them, let's be like them. And there's something for all of us to learn. And today we have a story of a lady who did something really astonishing the night before Jesus rode in on that donkey, which was a part of Passover, and many of us know it today as Palm Sunday. And it was a great offering that she would give Jesus as he would ride in as this king. And her name is Mary of Bethany, or you might know her as Martha's sister or Lazarus' sister. Lazarus is the man who was dead and was brought back to life by Jesus, and so this is really a famous family. Mary's most well known for being a good friend of Jesus. So in addition to these great things that were taking place in her family, she actually was a personal friend of Jesus. And as you'll see in a moment, there was nothing that she wasn't willing to give him because she loved him. Here's what's neat about Mary. I'll just say it from up front. Mary is an example of what happens a lot of times in people's families. You have a woman who gets things right when it comes to faith in God, when all of the men around her don't get it right, okay? And that can be a lonely job, right, if you're the only one. But Mary was the first, you could say, in her family to really understand who Jesus was, and also in this crowd that was mostly made up of men. She was the first to get it right. And so since we're talking about women who were first to get it right, I want to tell you the story about my mom and honor her today. My mom, Rita Carlucci, is a special lady. She was one of 8 kids who grew up, unfortunately, in a really negative environment. She grew up in an abusive and controlling and manipulative family. The abuse came at the hand of her mother, and her dad just kind of allowed it to happen. And so in addition to that being just the whole horror being their kind of normal everyday life, she has a lot of confusion that comes with that, and it was emerging as she was a young girl. She was confused because the very people she should have been learning love from and receiving love from and learning about how the world works were the people that were hurting her. So that created tons of confusion. And then on top of that, you have these abusive people talking about God and Jesus and going to church and putting a whole bunch of religious talk around this manipulation and control. And so it's no wonder that in my mom's early 20s, she kind of moved away from God and moved away from a life with Jesus. And I don't think she was rejecting God, but she just did what a lot of young adults do today. They just say, it doesn't really matter. The investment isn't worth it, and it doesn't make a difference in my life. And so my mom kind of moved away from the faith that she was taught as a kid. Well, she marries my dad. My dad also at the time is not interested in walking with Jesus, and they're married for a few years. They start a business in southern Colorado, and they have me. I'm the oldest of 3 boys. And I think my mom thought, oh my goodness, we need some extra help. We need some reinforcement. So at that time, she decided that she was going to go back to church. And so she started taking me, and then along came my 2 younger brothers, and she would take us all by herself week after week. So week after week, month after month, year after year, my mom was loading us up to go. The first church we went to was a little Methodist church in Monte Vista. And the 2 things I remember about it is the church looked like a castle, and I would sneak out of the service and go and burn the edges of the choir robes in the back on the candles, but just enough that it wouldn't cause a big fire. And so that's all I remember from that experience, so it was a positive experience. My first church experience was very positive. My mom moved us all to another church in town that had a youth ministry and children's programs and groups for adults that were meeting in the week. There was just a lot more life, and she thought, this is a better place for my boys to meet some other people like them who are also following Jesus. And of course, that's what happened. But during that time, my mom had the lonely job of loading us up all by herself on Sundays when all of us, my dad wasn't going, us boys were saying, why do we have to go? I'd rather stay home and watch football or do anything else. But every week after week, month after month, year after year, mom would load us up. And usually we'd have a huge fight on the way to church. All hell would break loose on the car on the way to church. I'm sure that doesn't happen to any of you. But my mom was tough, and she got through. Summers would come, and we were really into sports, and so we'd go to camps and go to these different training things, and she'd say, well, if you're going to do that, you're also going to go to camp at the church. And I can remember thinking, well, how church camp isn't any fun, and then I come back saying, oh, it's the greatest week of my life, only to forget it a year later and then have to be talked into it again, of course, by my mom to go. My mom was a woman who got it right, surrounded by men who weren't ready to see it yet. And I'm so glad she did. Her faithfulness, her strength, her love for Jesus led to all of those things being true for her 3 sons and her husband. It's an incredible story. My mom's a special lady. Now, Mary is kind of like this in a similar way. She sees something that others don't, and she's willing to do certain things that others aren't willing to do. And here's what it is that Mary sees. She's certainly not the first follower of Jesus, okay? But she might be, you could make a good case for this, that she is the first to believe in the gospel, okay? She's the first to understand that he must die so that we can all live, okay? She was maybe the first to understand that, and I think you'll see that in the story. So I'm going to read from John chapter 12, but as you see the verse behind me, you can see that some of that font is in a different color. I've included details from Mark and Matthew that aren't included in John, okay? John is the only one that gives us the name of the woman. It's Mary, Mary of Bethany. But here's some other details. And I just want you to picture what was taking place here. And here's what we're looking for. We're looking at the beauty of the offering, okay? And we're also looking at the beauty of the message that's contained in the offering. So chapter 12, 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Here a dinner was given in Jesus' honor in the home of Simon the leper. Martha served while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. Then Mary took an alabaster jar, about a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume. She broke the jar and poured the perfume on his head. Then she poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped it with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But one of the disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected. Why the waste? Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief, a keeper of the money bag, and he used to help himself to what was put inside of it. Verse 7, leave her alone, Jesus replied. She has done a beautiful thing to me. It was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. But she did what she could. She poured perfume on my body beforehand to prepare me for my burial. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me. And then Matthew and Mark give us this detail. Truly, I tell you, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. Nice way to end it. The humble lady is the one that is lifted up and held high. So as I go through the story, I want you just to be thinking about a couple things that I think will actually challenge us, and hopefully that's one of the reasons we come together on Sundays, is to be challenged. A couple things to think about that are really the application to the message, and I'll end with this. The first is this idea that we see this mention of this alabaster jar that's being broke. But the alabaster jar is a metaphor for a number of different things in our life, okay? There are many alabaster jars, and the alabaster jar represents those things in life that we find our security in, our identity in. They give us a good sense of self, and they're the things, you could put it this way, that we love, trust, and serve more than God, okay? There are many alabaster jars in our lives, and we all have certain things. So what is that, okay? And then second is, let's follow this old Christian practice, especially with the gospel stories, where we imagine ourselves in the story and we wonder what it would be like. But here's how we're going to wonder what it would be like. Who of the characters in this story are we most like? Okay, and let's be honest, and I'll be the first to be honest today. I'm more like Judas than I am Mary, certainly. Not in the sense that I'm stealing your tithes, okay? Pastor must say that. Golly. That'll get some internet attention. But that judgment comes so easily from me towards other people, okay? And just not even being able to get out of my own head and say things, I would say certainly things like he did. What a waste. This could be used in different ways. So think of who you are in the story. Now, love is the theme, okay? It would be a mistake to think that this story is about giving or wealth or money or earning and savings or even about a sacrifice. All of those things are in view. They're all outcomes, but they are all a result of Mary's passionate love for Jesus. She was gripped by love for him, and when that happens, people, just like Mary, begin to do things that are very, very different. So I just want you to think about love for a moment and how powerful it is and how it acts as a powerful motivator and changes the way we live our lives. When a person loves someone else, so whether it's romantic love of being in love or a parent for a child or for friends or whatever that might be, when you really love someone, you begin to think things that you didn't think before, and you begin to do things that you didn't do before. And so, I mean, we just know this. So like when a couple falls in love, a young couple, we often say as they're kind of just making not so great decisions that love is blind, right? But there's no talking them out of certain things because love is powerful. But love also allows us to see things that maybe others wouldn't. And so a parent for their child, they see their potential. They see what could be. Why? Because they love them. And so love allows us to see things that we normally don't see. Love asks us to do things that we might not normally do. So one of those things is make promises. Real love intrinsically desires permanence. And so it wants to make promises. So that's why when you love someone, you say things like, I'll always be here for you. I'm never going to leave. I'll always love you. That's what real love always wants to do. By the way, that's why we exchange vows at a wedding. Because real love makes promises and it closes the options to say you, okay? Real love makes promises. And so, in a sense, Mary's making a promise here. Love also makes sacrifices. And the reason love wants to make sacrifices is because all of life has been reoriented for the person that is now experiencing love for another person. There's new priorities. There's new things that you would call treasures in your life. And so you used to think these things are important, but once you begin to love someone, they go up above those other things, right? Isn't this how love works? And so we act and live differently. The reason Mary is able to pour out a jar of perfume that was worth a year's wages is because she is gripped by love for Jesus, and her life has been completely reoriented because of love. And so to her, she might say, yeah, it's a big deal what I was able to do if you were to ask her after this moment, but it was small because I love Jesus. Now, how did she get here? A person doesn't get to this place in just a moment, but they get to this place of deep love for Jesus by a couple things. First is by friendship, and the second is by being loved by him. And so we see both of these things happening in her life. In Luke chapter 10, Jesus shows up at the house of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, and they're there having a dinner. So picture this, the disciples are there, and Martha is up, and she's doing her thing. She's working really hard. She's pulling out the food. And Mary, her younger sister, who you would think would be working with her older sister to make this a great party, is just sitting at the feet of Jesus listening to him. There's nothing better in this moment for her than to be with Jesus. And she knows as good as it is to serve him, it's even better to just enjoy him. And so she listens to his voice. And friendship starts to emerge between her and Jesus. And Jesus actually says to Martha, because Martha comes up to Jesus and says, are you going to do anything about my lazy sister? And Jesus says, it's not about being lazy. Jesus knew this. She was experiencing love and reprioritizing things in her life. So she sits at his feet and she listens. Then in John chapter 11, maybe a year or two later, Mary is again with Jesus, but this time it's not just friendship, but Jesus is going to care for her and her family. This moment is clouded with tragedy. Her brother Lazarus had died. We know that Mary and Martha were beginning to think that Jesus wasn't an ordinary man because as Lazarus was sick and nearing his death, they call for Jesus, they send word, they ask for him to come and help. Jesus takes his time. He doesn't show up on time. Lazarus dies. He's in the grave for 3 days before Jesus shows up. Martha runs out and says, if you would have been here, our brother would be alive. Jesus cares for her. And then he asks Martha, where's your sister? Go and get her. So Mary comes. And what do we see in the story? That Mary falls down at his feet and she weeps. She mourns with Jesus, and Jesus mourns with her. He cries with her. This is what friends do. But then taking it further, Jesus did for Mary and Martha what he will ultimately do for every person in the future, and that is bring about a resurrection, okay? We know, like, this is the week where we remember Passover, innocent death, and resurrection is our future, right, for all of us. And this is kind of a foreshadow of that. So the grieving stops because Jesus goes to the tomb and he speaks into the tomb and he says to Lazarus to come out. He walks out, a dead man who came back to life, who was risen. He says, take off those rags because he is not dead, he is alive. So she has learned from him. She's mourned with him. She's even questioned Jesus, which is okay to do. When you are a person who loves God and you suffer, the suffering is actually two parts. Not only do we have to suffer with the events that are causing the pain, but we have to struggle with a God who allowed them to happen, okay? That's why suffering is really hard for people in the room. It's the second part. Mary wasn't afraid to question Jesus, and she let her suffering bring her to him and not apart. So she has all of these things. So this kind of makes sense why, when you look at John chapter 11, right before our story in verse 45, that many Jews are coming to Mary with questions about Jesus. They saw her as an authority to teach them about what he was doing and who he was and what his life would represent and mean. And then this great event takes place. Jesus shows up in Bethany, and I think Lazarus, Mary, Martha, this man referred to as Simon the leper, they all get together and they plan what's about to take place. They said, we're going to throw a party in honor of Jesus. I don't think this was a spontaneous moment with Mary busting the jar on Jesus' feet. I think it was planned. They're all there together. After all, isn't this the type of thing you would do if someone brought a loved one back to life for you? So this party is given in Jesus' honor. So picture this. Jesus is the guest of honor. Lazarus is, he's like a trophy. He's a celebrity. He was dead and now he's alive. And that's why we see in the passage that people are peeking in the windows and doors to get a glimpse at Lazarus. Could it be true, they're saying? So he's sitting there. Martha is working and cooking. Simon the leper is there as well. He's the host. He's grateful because Jesus had healed him. So there's a lot of grateful people. The disciples are there. And Jesus knows that he's just days away from being put up on a cross. And Mary, maybe planned, maybe not, comes in. She breaks a jar of perfume and pours it on his head and his feet. And what she gives to Jesus is a beautiful offering. Here's what I want you to know about what Jesus says about her offering that's helpful for us. She did what she could, okay? Not everyone can do this, but she did what she could. And it's kind of the same thing when Jesus celebrated the poor widow who made a small offering. Is basically she did what she could. And he honors that. Now, what Mary gives to Jesus is an offering more than it's a gift. And I want you to notice the difference. An offering is something you give someone that you want to honor, or they deserve it, or you owe their allegiance to. A gift is something we give our friends. Gifts are things that God gives us. They can often be undeserved. But offerings are always deserved, okay? So more than a gift, this is an offering that she's given to Jesus. And it's extravagant, equivalent to a year's wages. That alabaster jar itself would have been a very valuable vessel. And inside is this very expensive perfume, and she comes in and she pours it all out on Jesus. So it's this combination of great worth that's represented in the alabaster jar. But here's what I want you to see. That jar represents more than just physical wealth. It has more than just financial value. It means a lot to Mary. It means her whole life. Some people often ask, how is it that Mary and Martha and Lazarus have this type of cumulative wealth? I mean, most people don't have a year's worth of wages in savings, right? And they certainly didn't back then. Most people were very, very poor. So some people say, well, they just worked hard and they saved and they pulled all the family's wealth together, maybe all the wealth of the town. That's one explanation. But the one that I think is most likely is that Mary and Martha had lost their parents, and that jar was the accumulation of their inheritance, and it represented a dowry to be used with a future husband to make them a more attractive bride in the future. And so it might have been the dowry for both Mary and Martha, or just Mary's, but nonetheless, it reflected more than financial security. It represented a future. Because at this time, young women didn't have a lot of choices. They didn't have much of a future without men taking them as wives. It's just the way the ancient world was. And so if this really was a jar that represented a dowry, she was in her moment shattering her hopes and security on the head and feet of Jesus. Now, one reason we think that this is most likely a dowry is in Luke chapter 7, another young woman who is different than Mary comes in and does a similar thing to Jesus. She too has this thing that's been given to her by her family that represents her hopes for a husband and a family in the future. So imagine this. She's giving him something of great financial worth, but she's giving him her hopes in a moment. It's a beautiful offering. But it goes even further. There's a third thing that she gives. Not just all that she has, not just all of her hopes, but she really gives Jesus all that she is, all of herself, okay? So there's this little detail that shows up in some of the readings, and it says that she wiped his feet, cleaned his feet with her hair. Now, for this to happen during this time in this context, Mary would have had to let her hair down, which was something that women did not do in public. So at a certain age, young Jewish girls were taught that you wear your hair up because it was a sign of maturity and modesty. And that someday when you stand before your husband, you let your hair down. 1 Corinthians says a woman's hair is her glory. Her glory, okay? So Mary lets down her hair, her glory, and begins to wipe his feet. She is not concerned with holding anything back from him in this moment. She's offering herself completely to Jesus because she loves him. She's not concerned about her reputation. I mean, after all, everyone in the room is talking about her, right? They're judging her. It was palpable. She had to part the judgment just to get to Jesus. She's laying down her pride, and she's giving him her heart completely. Nothing is held back. See, the offering in this story is not really the oil. It's her heart. And that's why we're talking about it today. She gave Jesus all she had, all her hopes, and all of her. It's given to Jesus in this moment. Now, this is a beautiful offering, but it also becomes a beautiful message. And there is a message in the offering that's important for us to see today. I think Mary actually believed Jesus when he said things like, "Before I am glorified, I have to be humiliated. That victory is going to come through suffering. That the Son of Man must lay down his life first before he can lift other people up." I think she's actually one of the only ones in this crowd of people that are following Jesus, including the 12 disciples, that believes that he's a king that has to rule and win in a very different way. And so you look at the story and you say, of course, what she's doing is she's anointing Jesus as king, because you can read in 1 Samuel chapter 10 that this was a custom. You would anoint a king, or you would anoint a prophet or a priest, and you would anoint them because it was just a sign that God was with them and had poured out his favor upon them. But I think Mary knows that he's not just a king, but he's a Messiah. And Messiah literally means the one smeared with oil. Okay? It's the same word. It's the Hebrew word for Christ. Christ is the Greek word. That Jesus would be that one that God had poured out favor upon, and it would be the Messiah that would lead to people's liberation. So Mary shows up and she's thinking, he's a king, he's a Messiah, but she also knows that oil is used to prepare a body for burial. No one else sees this. We don't know for sure if she's understanding the gospel, but it sure seems like it. While the other 12 disciples struggle to conceive of a kingdom that would begin not with the death of their enemies, but with the death of their friend, Mary is beginning to understand. And this is what she's understanding. Listen to this. There is no throne without a cross. There is no kingdom without a grave. There is no victory without death. She's understanding these things. She understands that Jesus is here not only to give us all that he has, not only to give us all of his hopes, and not only to give us all of himself, but he's here to do all of those things so that we might respond in the same way. And remember, this is happening during the great Jewish feast of Passover. That's the climate, that's the setting. I mean, it's like the 4th of July times 100. The theme is liberation and freedom from bondage, and the fact that God saves his people. And so they're remembering this time that God had saved the Jewish people from Egypt, but they're also thinking, God, could there be a time that you come and save us from our enemies again? Because once again, they're oppressed. This time it's by the Romans. And just as in the first Passover, an innocent life had to be lost or be given up, life was taken from someone that was innocent. Once again, life would be taken from one that was innocent, that would lead to freedom and liberation for others. I think Mary is actually the best theologian of all of them here. I mean, everyone's thinking Jesus is coming just to win and kick some butt. Look what happens the next day, John chapter 12. They're throwing down palm branches. They're treating him like a king. They're saying, Hosanna, God save us. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. They thought Jesus was coming in to defeat the enemies, the physical enemies. But there is no throne without a cross. There is no reign without a resurrection. And there's no victory without an ultimate death. So she's not just anointing a king. She's preparing him for burial. And isn't that what Jesus says? He doesn't remind them in this moment that he's the king. He said he's reminding them of something that's about to happen. See, here's why Mary can do what she does here in the story. Remember, she gave all she had. She gave up all her hopes. She gave to Jesus all of herself. She knows that she can do that because Jesus is the model from the very thing that she's doing. Jesus first gave up all that he had. Jesus first gave up all of his hopes. And Jesus first gave all of himself to people like me and you and Mary, so that when the time comes when Jesus says, I want all of you, it is not quite so strange to think that a person could give all of themselves to him. Why? Because it's safe. Because he has given all of himself to us. There's a phrase that I use with men when we meet for discipleship, and I try to teach them this idea: all of him for all of us, or all of you for all of me. And here's the idea. There's this paradox in Scripture that God takes us as we are. He won't love us any more or any less if we do more good things or bad things. We can't lose his favor. We can't lose his love. It's all there. He accepts us just as you are. Your past, your present, your future. He loves you, and he cares about you, and he cares about us. There's that side of the paradox. But the other side is that he loves us so much that he wants all of us. And he will not settle until he has us all. He's saying all along the way, all of me for all of you. Because he knows that when a person gives Jesus all that they are, that is the place that joy sets in and can't be taken away. And that is what all of us humans really are after, joy. A kind that circumstances cannot take. So all of me for all of you, and Mary says, I get it. Maybe her sister understood. Maybe Lazarus understood as well. Maybe that's why they're maybe all a part of this. But all of me, Jesus, for all of you. It's a huge thank you. And it's really the only way to respond to Jesus when you see him for who he truly is. Now, but remember, Mary doesn't get here in her first moment. She had to sit at his feet and listen. She had to experience friendship with him. She had to see how Jesus cares for her. All of these things are what takes place in a person's life before a person can say, I'm in at this level. All of me for all of you. Now let's go back to ourselves. And in the beginning, I asked you to think about a couple things. And the first is to identify some of those jars that are in your own life. The things that we love, trust, and serve more than God. The things that we would say about ourselves, boy, that's a waste if we were to give that up or let go of it. And so it might be possessions and money, but it might be control and security. It might be you just wanting to do things your way, knowing that what God's asking you to do things a different way. And you might even trust that his way is a good way, but you're not willing to give up control. Maybe that's the thing. Maybe your story is the thing that you won't give up. I mean, one thing that most people share in common is that we go through life and get wounded and nicked along the way, but there are a lot of people who won't give God their stories of grief. And so they stay in this place of hurt and they stay victims. They won't give it to him. There are others that won't give up their reputation. They won't say yes to the right things, no to the right thing, or the correct things, because they want people to think of them in a certain way. There's others of us who won't, time is the thing that's hard to give up, or our dreams. But here's the question I've been asking myself all week. When is the last time I emptied out anything for Jesus? When is the last time I stopped measuring the offering? When is the last time I just acted out of gratitude and love and stopped thinking? When is the last time I emptied it out? So I think it's part of the story of Mary. Well, here's the other thing for us to think about. Who are we like? And we might not be like Judas, the one that would betray Jesus, but we're probably all like Judas in the sense that we're quick to judge. We're quick to say of people, why is it that they do things that way? Or look how emotional they are as they worship or as they express themselves before God. Aren't we quick to judge people for their behavior that's different than ours? Even if really what we should be doing is learning from them? We're very quick, right? So one of the other applications is we can say, God, move in, and just in the same way that he lifted Mary up, but he confronted Judas, we need God to confront that judgment inside of us in a loving way. Because we want less of that and more of what Mary had. See, it wasn't just money that kept Judas from knowing Jesus this way, but it was his pride and his judgment. And so there's a number of things for us to think about. More of Mary in us and less of Judas. But could we take a risk and just empty something for him? So I want to invite you just to bow your heads. You can bring down the lights. The worship team's going to come out. And I just want to give us a chance to reflect quietly. We'll go to the quiet place of prayer. What would it take today for us to humble ourselves a little more than we are right now? I don't think it's just a coincidence that when we see Mary, we see her sitting at Jesus' feet, weeping at his feet, and serving at his feet. She got very, very low to honor him, to serve him, and in so doing, she was lifted up. She understood the last shall be first, that you must lose your life to gain it, that the seed must fall and die before it gives fruit. She understood all of these mysterious things that Jesus had said, and we know it because she stayed humble. And so what is it that maybe you need? To sit at his feet and listen? To see him move in your life and do for you what no one else can do, just as he did for her and her brother? Is it to mourn with him? Is it to question him? I know there's some people in the room, the humility will lead you to serve him, to bring a beautiful offering that matches his worth. And so, Lord, as we do these types of things and we just try to reorient our heart and point ourselves in a better direction, fear comes in and doubt comes in and questioning comes in. But I ask for protection from that for people today and this week. God, I pray that we would focus on is a God who had everything in heaven. Nothing was wanting, yet he left it all so that he only knew want while he walked on this earth. And that he was someone that had a secure future, but he laid it all down for others. He gave up all of his hopes for the sake of other people. And then in Jesus we see how God was unwilling to hold back anything from us. He said, you have my very best. May we see that you have said, all of me, all of me, all of me. But we would hear you calling us to something higher for all of you. And so, Lord, help each one of us apply this message in a way that would honor you today. It will be very different. It will look 100 different ways. But show us how we can move towards all of us. All of you for all of me. The humble shall be lifted up. The last shall be first. Let us see what that is like, Lord. We trust you and we love you and we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, let's stand together.